Introduction to code. What is code? At the most basic level, what is code? Yeah. A language. A language for what?
Communicating with your computer.
Right. So it's instructions, it's communicating with your computer. It is basically you, right, telling your computer what you want it to do. It is pretty much the most simplest way to put it, but also it applies no matter what kind of code you're writing, because humans wrote code, right? We created computers, and then we naturally created the way for us to communicate with them. Okay. So, there is a person, maybe it's me, maybe it's you, and there's your happy computer. Everybody's very happy in this scenario. Okay. So, also, the thing to know about code is that you've probably heard a lot of different words used when it comes to code, right? And people talk about coding in about a million different ways, using a million different languages, and it's sort of just like, what is that all about, right? So at the end of the day, right, it's essentially a lot of code is essentially the same thing, just put into another version of a coding language. So in the same way that we can speak English and the computer will respond with beeps, we can also speak French, we can speak Chinese, we can speak whatever language we want, and the computer also has different ways of doing literally the exact same thing in a different computer coding language, right? And so what's really nice, actually, is that by the end of this institute, once you know one, you'll actually be able to translate pretty well into other ones. If for some reason you go back to your newsroom and you have to use a different language than the ones that we're teaching you. There's also sort of sets of coding languages that all have a very similar syntax, in the same way that like Romance languages all have very similar grammar and verb tenses, versus once you like move off of that, all of that changes, the rules change, right? It's the same thing in coding. There's sort of like families of code in which they use very similar language, and all you have to do once you know how to do it is look up like, how do I do this thing in blank language? And then you're pretty much set. Okay, so now what's really great and terrible about computers is that they're very literal, right? So if I say something like, can you color me in with some cool colors? The computer will say, okay, right? It never objects, right? Unless you give it a bad command, which we'll talk about. But it'll say, okay, and then you'll end up with something like this, right? It doesn't really care, right? It has some definition of the words that you're using, and it will just execute literally what you're telling it to do. And it doesn't deviate from that. So oftentimes we don't get the result that we're thinking of, but it's because of the way that we phrased it. Usually, right, we're used to talking to another human being that can interpret things and like understands implications, but computers just do not. They are very literal. So along those lines, right, computers are good at following instructions, but not at reading your mind, said by a guy who's a big deal. All right. So this is my rendition of Eve from WALL-E. But anyway, so let's pretend for a second that Eve is crossing the street. Eve is a very smart computer, but let's pretend for a second that like everything has been downgraded a little bit and Eve can only understand literal instructions, right? So this is my brain teaser for everybody, which is Eve wants to cross the street. And the people who have programmed Eve have essentially given her a set of instructions, which include, right, go up to the street, look left, look for any cars. If there are cars, wait a second, right? If there are no cars, look to the right, look for any cars. If there are cars, wait a second, and then repeat, right? So left, right, left. If there are no cars, right, in all three instances, that's when you can proceed across the street. Okay, so this is what we tell children, like from the very beginning when they first cross streets. But for some reason, Eve refuses to cross the street. Does anybody have an idea why?
Explicitly across the street.
You also didn't mention, are the cars moving? Are they stopped?
Yes.
Do you still see the car?
Great. Yes. Okay. So, right, a child understands that if you see a car, it's probably moving, right? And that's why you don't want to cross the street because you're going to get hit. Eve has like no concept that this is the case. And so in this brain teaser, right, one, I didn't sort of tell her literally cross the street at the end. I just told her, like, you're ready to. But even if we amend that, she wouldn't if there are any parked cars on the street, right? And so as long as she sees a car, she will not move, versus like a human does not need that explicit amount of instruction. So that sort of just goes to demonstrate, right? Like we have to be very explicit. And whenever you don't get what you're asking for, I would just literally follow your own instructions, pretending like you are the computer, and see like, where could this go wrong? Where could I interpret this in a more literal way that doesn't make sense to a human, but would make sense literally? Okay. So this is where I want to know what programming languages all of you have heard of. And when I say languages, I actually mean any sort of like programming terms. Even if you like don't even know if it's a language, you just know it has something to do with coding. Tell me what it is. And I've mentioned some during the introduction of this week today.
Python.
Python. Wow, let's start there. Okay. I'm going to put Python over here. Ruby. Okay. Java. Okay, hold on. Okay. HTML. R. Put that. I put Python too far away. It's okay. I'll put R here. All right. What else?
Objective-C.
Okay. jQuery. Objective-C.
Visual Basic.
Oh my God. Okay. Visual Basic.
JavaScript.
Okay. SQL I heard, and then I also heard JavaScript. Other words. They don't even have to be languages. I mean, you can continue with the languages. There are more. But they can also just be general terms you've heard around coding if you want. PHP. I'll put this here. Okay. PHP. SQL's here. API. Okay. RSS. Where do I put RSS? I'll put RSS over here. Okay. Open source. Okay. Let's do that down here, maybe. Open source. It's a great term. Okay. Debugging. I'll put that down here too. Git. Git is good. Someone say Unix? Oh, Linux. I'll put Linux over here, actually. Okay. Are there other words? I don't know if you have ever sort of looked around a job posting for programmers, and they sometimes use terms around what they want. Yeah, software. Should I write software over here? Wait, front end? Yeah, front end, back end. So, yeah, right? Okay, let's do this. Front end. Back end. Full stack. Okay. Version control. This is your chance. Any other words that you've heard of? Responsive. Oh, man. Okay. Yes. Other terms. Has anyone ever heard of, usually people say Ruby on Rails, sorry. So you guys know. All right. Python. There's something that goes with Python that is said with Python a lot of times. It's sad because it's not as catchy, but there's another word. It's also part of a movie title.
Python's on a plane.
Django. Let's see, what else? JavaScript, PHP. Any other words? D3. True. That one is used a lot. Mm-hmm. Yes, okay. Object-oriented programming. Put that up here. Okay. This is pretty good for now, I think. We can add, as I go through them, if you think of something, right, in the same way that like Ruby on Rails made you think of something, just let me know, shout it out, okay? So my first question is, who knows what all of the words on this board means? Okay, does anybody know what 50% of the words on this board means? Okay, okay. I think we're in a good place. So here is how I'm going to start. We're going to start with this right here. All right. So the first thing to know is that there are programming languages that are by default able to be read on the internet. What I mean by that, right, is that we'll talk about this in depth, but the way that code executes sometimes is that all of you use some sort of browser to access the internet, right? You don't just like directly connect with your brain. And so Safari, Internet Explorer, Netscape, Chrome, right, Firefox, they all are web browsers, and they all automatically read certain coding languages. So all of them are able to read HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and PHP. Talk about jQuery in a second. But basically, anything else on this board, they can't read automatically. They need a little bit of help. You might have to install a plugin. You might have to download something. They can't read by default. But these 4 languages right here, every single browser can read and can execute right away. And so oftentimes, when we're talking about front-end programming, we're talking about programming in any of these languages. Because the front end is what you, the reader, or the user sees, right? So that's what people mean by, I want a front-end developer. Usually means I want someone who can design websites. Okay. Now, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are also what we're going to be focusing on this week in terms of coding. HTML and CSS, often you might have seen it written basically like this with like a slash, like HTML/CSS. The way that this sort of structure works is that on a website, HTML is sort of like all of the structure and the actual words that are on the page, right? The CSS stands for cascading style sheets. It's basically like how you design that structure, right? What colors are and where it should be. And then JavaScript is sort of the interactivity. A really good, well, I'll be using a lot of metaphors. One metaphor to explain this is if you think about like the human body, the HTML is sort of your bones, right? Those stop changing after a certain age, and they are sort of set, and they sort of hold you up, right? But then everybody sort of like has those bones, and then CSS, everybody looks different, right? So this sort of like determines every single other attribute about you around that structure. And then the JavaScript is often described as sort of like the muscles that actually move you around, as opposed to being like a statue. Like HTML and CSS would be a really great statue. But if you want it to move, if you want it to change, right, you need JavaScript. Okay. Now, jQuery is something that you can think of as essentially abridged JavaScript. So the way it works is that people who are really great at writing programming languages want to write them more quickly, right? Some of you might find yourself in that situation one day in which you're like, wow, I'm really tired of writing the same thing over and over again. I wish I could just write myself a shortcut. And eventually what happened was jQuery was born, which is it's like a huge shortcut to most of JavaScript. It is not built for any specific purpose other than to make writing JavaScript easier. And so it's not, and we'll talk about D3 in a second, which is basically JavaScript for data viz. jQuery is literally just like use me to write less JavaScript and to accomplish the same thing in a way that's more readable to humans, in a way that's less typing, literally, most of the time. And so you can't use jQuery without JavaScript. It is basically a subset of it in which people wrote all the long stuff and then said, like, call it this short thing, and now all of you can use the short thing. Mm-hmm.
But it's still something that all computers and browsers can use?
Yes, because it is written entirely in JavaScript. So it's basically like a subset. Yeah. So PHP, I haven't talked about that yet. Websites sometimes are more than sort of just a web page that you see. What it does is it accesses, say, like a database. because you need to like log in, right, with your password, and we're not going to store that on the website itself. That would be a terrible idea. And so PHP is what allows these front-end languages to access some sort of back-end server database. A lot of you maybe have heard of or used WordPress, right? And if you like dig into the guts, it always wants you to write in PHP. And WordPress is built in PHP, and that's because WordPress also is like a CMS, right? Oh, that's another word that I didn't put on here, CMS. But WordPress, right, is a content management system, meaning that it helps you sort of store all your content. You need to log in. You need to save all that content somewhere. And if I literally tried to save every website manually on a server, that would be a nightmare. And so you have a database that PHP allows you to connect to. Any questions about this part right here? Okay, so related words, right? So D3 is actually D3.js. Anything that you see with a .js anywhere on the website means it's a JavaScript file, which means someone has written yet another shortcut for you to write more JavaScript for a specific purpose. D3 is data-driven documents. Yeah, there we go, is what the 3 Ds are. But really, it is most commonly used to create data visualizations, but it is created to sort of just help you manipulate things inside of your browser a little more easily when it's for interactivity. So the creator, Mike Bostock, doesn't call it like a data visualization library, because that's not all it does. But most people, in journalism at least, use it for that purpose. Responsive, I put that here. So responsive is basically like when we're looking at a website, we want it to work and we want it to be able to look a little different on different screen sizes. So whether it's on your phone, on your tablet, on a huge TV, on your computer, right? Like sometimes websites adapt. You don't just want like a shrunken version of what you normally see. There's sort of like pros and cons to this. At the very beginning, when smartphones were first invented, right, everybody was like, look, I can zoom in on the New York Times. It's like the same thing. But now people realize like that's kind of like a crappy experience on your phone, right? Like you don't want to like zoom in to see. And so people write CSS that is for every single one of those screen sizes. And you basically, right, the structure never changes. The content doesn't change. The HTML does not change. But you write CSS that says, okay, if the screen is like this wide, I want it to look this way. When it's this wide, I want it to look this way. And when it's wider than 1,000 pixels, I want it to look this way. So that's why I put it right here. But responsive is sort of a way to describe your web design. If it's responsive, it means that you have CSS that adapts to different screen sizes. Okay, so let's get to backend next. All right, and we will go here, and I'll group these together. Okay, so front-end programming means front-end stuff that normal people get to actually consume and see. Backend stuff is mostly all behind the scenes. It's managing the database. It's getting functions to happen that you don't even know about, you don't have to hear about, because they do it all in the background so that you can see a really nice final result in the front end. But a lot of the very important work that actually makes a lot of the stuff that we do even possible happens in the backend. So in journalism, the most common backend languages that are used are Python and Ruby. I'm going to draw like a little thing here. All right, so Python and Ruby are programming languages, just in the same way that, say, JavaScript and PHP are programming languages. They allow you to do things like addition, or to make games, or to make software that's on your computer. Python and Ruby are both also capable of scraping websites. We'll be using Python in week 3 to do just that. But on their own, right, they are often paired with something that's called a framework, in order to create a lot of websites and a lot of the news apps that we make at ProPublica. So Django and Rails are both names of frameworks that are specifically built for these programming languages. So you can't crisscross. You can't use Ruby with Django. You can't use Python with Rails. It just doesn't work, because Django is written in Python and Rails is written in Ruby, in the same way that jQuery is just written in JavaScript. Okay? Now, which one you use is a question that we get a lot. In the end, it really doesn't matter, as long as you know one or the other, because it's literally the same as like French versus English kind of a difference, which is they grammatically almost identical. You just have to change the syntax a little bit, but they do almost everything the same. Which one a newsroom uses most often depends on like who got there first and how many people use that language on that team if there was more than one person. So at ProPublica, we are a Ruby shop, and I was hired here having known Python, and I just learned Ruby in the first 3 months. And sometimes now we use Python because we've hired more people who have Python experience, and so now it's sort of like a mix, but we're still predominantly Ruby. But again, it really doesn't matter for you guys. The key is if you, like when we do web scraping, you are really into it and you want to keep doing that kind of stuff, the language that I would recommend is sort of like what community geographically exists around you so that you have people to ask about it. Does that make sense? Okay. So then what's the point of Django and Rails? Like, why do I need a framework, right? So you can imagine it like this. Charlie talked about dollars for docs the other day, right? Which is look up any doctor. You basically see the exact same page, but with different content. But everything looks the same, right? Everybody's doctor is in the same font and the same headline size, and you see unique information to them, but you can tell it's all pretty much designed the same way. Now, we have like billions of records across all of our apps and like pages that we have published on the internet. If we had to manually build all of those in HTML and CSS, that would just be like a disaster. Like, it's not physically possible. So, essentially, a framework like Django and Rails allows you to create a template, right? So it hooks up. So all of these languages, right, automatically can talk to the database. And PHP can do the same thing. Basically, it hooks up to a database and it says, depending on like the ID code in the URL, or depending on the name in the URL, I want you to look up this person in the database and fill in my HTML and CSS and JavaScript with all of that content based on what code you're given. And so oftentimes you'll see, like, if you go to a website that has this templating system, there's only one part of the URL that changes, right? And that's a doctor's ID. Maybe it's like the full name of a school or something like that. But it allows you to have a unique URL, a unique generated website without needing to literally manually make all of them. Okay. So that's super helpful. As you get through it, there's also sort of like other things that help you do stuff like manage your database, et cetera. We don't have to get too much into that, but know that sort of these two go together, and it doesn't really matter which one you pick for what you learn. Okay. So Java, Objective-C, Visual Basic, C++. These are programming languages that are very rarely used in journalism, very commonly used in computer science. Do you have a question?
Yeah, just like historically, were all of, in terms of like the backend programming
languages,
were they all like kind of formed at the same time?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes and no, in the sense that like if you really want to like get into it, there are different tiers of programming languages. The ones that are like more abstract and closer to like the 010001 way that we used to talk to computers by giving them like numbers. And so there's sort of like layers of how easy it is for a normal human to read and use. And then the like more back end it gets, the closer to like the literally programming little circuits on a machine gets. And so some of these programming languages are different layers of that stack, which is also why sometimes it's called like a stack, right? It's like there's essentially like a stack of different languages that go deep into the rabbit hole. And like some of these, for example, Python and Ruby are built in languages that are on a separate layer. Does that make sense? Because they're faster, because they're less intuitive, and they more directly tell a computer how to use its resources. Yeah. Python and Ruby, I don't know if those two were created around the same time, but I know that they are very, it's like a sports team rivalry, right? Like people who use one are like, we're so much better, and like, you know, we can do this. And then the people on the other team are like, yeah, but we're so much better about this, so don't you want that? And it's really just a community of people who like want different things in their programming languages and want different things to be easier. And so they've sort of built up around that. Yeah, and those languages both sort of allow people to contribute and to keep adding things onto it. And so there's like huge conventions that are just around the programming language itself. Yeah. Fun fact, a lot of people think that Java and JavaScript are the same thing. They are not. Don't refer to them as the same thing. JavaScript is named after Java because when JavaScript was invented, Java was so popular that they wanted like a popular programming language to hook off of, and so they called it JavaScript. But they have nothing to do with each other. Java is pretty much like, we really don't use it in news anymore. It's what it's like the programming language that powers like when a website asks you to download Java, which was very common a long time ago. Those little like applets that show up that have the little like Java coffee thing and it like is a GIF for a while. Like Java is behind that. Objective-C, I believe, is what R is built out of, which we'll talk about in a second. And Visual Basic, C++, basically all of these languages, like you might learn as a computer science degree because they're sort of very fundamental. They talk very quickly to computers. They control computers very quickly. They're very efficient that way. But they're also not what most people sort of in the industry or in other industries even write because it's sort of that second layer of backend. Okay. Ads journals, I would say, like I wouldn't worry about this until you are like very comfortable with everything else, just because it's not necessary, honestly.
Okay. Have you highlighted so far or bracketed? Those are all programming languages?
Yes. Everything is a programming language, I guess except for this and this. They're not separate languages, they're concepts. And then, but yes, everything I've bracketed so far are programming languages. And then these two are frameworks that are paired with them. What was I going to say? Oh, right. The other thing to note about HTML and CSS that's a little different is that you sort of notice, like, when I talk about the programming languages over there, they're pretty much, like, capable of functionally anything, right? They can create any software that you want. So, like, any app that you use on your computer is written from a programming language. And so, obviously, like, back-end programming languages have their own way of designing stuff, right? Like, all the stuff that you guys use on your computers are not designed using HTML and CSS unless it's actually a website. But these two languages specifically are called markup languages. So I'll write that up here. It's not super important that you know this, but know what this term is. But I sort of just want to let you know because they describe the content on the page. They do not control the content on the page. And so there's no way in HTML for you to say, like, if somebody does X, then change the words, right? That's like totally in the realm of JavaScript. CSS is like bleeding into that a little bit as new updated versions of it come out. But these two are still known as sort of markup languages, and everything else is sort of more like a traditional programming language. And that's because it allows for you to do things like, say, if, then, which is one of the most basic things that we'll do. Okay. Questions about the words I've talked about so far? Yeah, sure. PHP, like I could easily put it over there as a back-end language because it is, but I put it over here because all of your browsers can automatically read it. It doesn't need anything special. So like if Safari wanted to read Python, you just need to do a little extra. It can't just automatically make it happen. Versus if you told it to read PHP, it would immediately be able to execute. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between HTML and HTML5?
Oh, sure. That is just a version, like HTML version 5. You can think about it like that. The language changes a little bit. And every time they don't do this very often. Like we don't see new versions of HTML and CSS very often because they collect a bunch of stuff and they release it at once. But they usually don't get rid of things from before. And so it's sort of like extra things you can do now that the internet has progressed and browsers have gotten better and faster. And so HTML5 is just like the latest version of HTML. Yeah. Same with CSS3. People have heard of that. Mm-hmm.
I think another thing I often hear along with markup is Markdown.
Yes. We can talk about Markdown. Markdown. Right. So actually, I'm going to write this somewhere else. Not next to markup, but over here. I'm also going to add GitHub to this, even though all of you already have it installed. Okay, so Markdown is a file type. It is not a programming. Well, I guess maybe it's similar to HTML and CSS in that what it lets you do is write like normal text, right? You're like, I'm writing my blog post. And then instead of writing HTML for a link or something like that, you just put some like brackets around a word, and then you put a parentheses afterward, and you put the URL in. And Markdown can export as HTML and CSS. And so it gives you sort of like even more simplified ways to essentially write HTML without needing to know any code. A good example of this is if you guys have ever edited Wikipedia, there's like this weird syntax that you use to add links and things like that. That is like a Markdown style. Wikipedia has their own flavor of Markdown, essentially. And any of you, if you want to write Markdown, you just create a file, and then you end it with .md. And that becomes a Markdown file, and you can write it that way. Yeah. New words that have popped into your heads because of what I have talked about. Flexbox. I'll put that here. Okay. Any other new words? There doesn't have to be. Okay, so Flexbox, I don't know if you're thinking of a specific product.
I was thinking, I guess, like, I know in the course, I guess, it was CSS and, like, the Flex model for using.
Yeah. There's different, like, there's different methods, I guess, of using CSS. That's more like a theory of, like, how to use it, right? So there's, like, basic CSS. Everyone can write anything that they want according to CSS rules, and then there's different ways for you to think about it. And flexible boxes is sort of like one way to do that. We will be getting into that a lot when we go through the CSS stuff, but sort of don't think of it as like a different, it's not a different language, it's sort of just like a different way of using one of the tools. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about, since we're over here, we'll talk about this, right? So I put this over here because GitHub, which all of you now have accounts to, their default file type is Markdown. And so if you just try to like edit a file on GitHub, it's by default a Markdown file. That's just because it's easiest to edit, and then they render out the HTML for you. Now, GitHub and Git, Lena will be talking about later in the week, but the key thing to note, right, is Git is a type of version control. A way to understand that is version control in the world of programming just means track changes for programming, right? So like every time I edit a file, we'll all run into this a lot, which is you'll like be on your merry way, your website looks great, and then suddenly it's all broken and you have no idea what changed, right? If it's all in a version control system, you just revert back one and you sort of get it working again, and then you can figure out going forward. Or you can take time to troubleshoot if it doesn't take an incredibly long amount of time. But sort of it just catches you and it saves every time you tell it to save every version of the file that you've ever touched, right? And Git is sort of one of the things that does that. Has anyone heard of another word that is associated with a version control? Logs, yeah, that's true. So you have a lot of Git logs. Basically what that does is it shows you like every timestamp of when you saved and then what your like little message was. So you can tell when like programmers get really frustrated, it's like F, 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 F. But anyway, the other word that comes with this is subversion sometimes, if you've ever heard of that. It used to be really popular, but then GitHub made Git really popular, and so now people use Git. There are two different versions. There's two different philosophies of version control, which we are not going to get into because it is not necessary at all. But GitHub is basically like the website that helps you use Git, right? And there are other websites. If you've heard of GitLab, they're the same thing as GitHub, literally, but they're just like more free. So it's the same sort of thing. Git is a type of version control, and a lot of different websites use it, including GitHub. Okay, so now let's talk about R and SQL. So did Olga talk about SQL at all? A little bit? What it's for? A little bit? Okay. So you guys all wrote functions in Excel, right? Or Google Sheets where you did equals and then whatever. Like, congratulations, you wrote a function. It is fantastic. And SQL, we can talk about that first. SQL, you've probably heard of like a million versions of this, right? Like MySQL, maybe NoSQL, SQLite, which I heard someone just say. It's all the same, really. Oh, you might have also heard of PostgreSQL, right? Okay, everything is just a version of SQL, and SQL is a programming language dedicated entirely to letting you query a database. So if you wanted to say, like, you're using a SQL database instead, you can't write those spreadsheets functions, You can do literally all of those things, though, in SQL. So you can say, like, take everything from the first column and sum up all the values, right? In SQL, that would just look like select, star, the name of your table, and then, like, you basically tell it whatever you want it to do. SQL is just significantly more powerful than using Excel or Google Sheets. It can handle way more rows of data. It knows how to optimize to look for things instead of, like, sometimes if you have a ton of data in Excel or Google Sheets, you have to, like, wait and wait and wait. The point in which SQL will make you wait is when you have an incredibly large amount of data set, right? A large amount of data. So it sort of just gives you way more scale, and it has really, really powerful things that it can do that Google Spreadsheets is at least trying to catch up with. But again, it's always limited to a smaller set of data. And so SQL is just really nice to know if you want to manipulate data really quickly and really easily. Mm-hmm.
Where does that, so like, what, it's like it's kind of, people like talk about SQL databases a lot.
Yeah.
But like, where do those, like, where is that data actually living, you know?
Oh,
it's
sure.
Not like, I don't know, it's not like GitHub where there's like a place where you can like upload your data into like, now it's a SQL database,
mm-hmm,
you know?
Mm-hmm. So this is a great question. All of your computers are capable of hosting a SQL database just in your computer, and then you just access that. Or people also pay for services to host a SQL database like somewhere else. So like Microsoft can host it for you, Amazon can host it for you. Like you can basically buy server space from someone else to host your databases. In the same way that you can also buy server space to host your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Python do similar things that SQL can do?
Yes.
And if that's the case, why don't you just learn Python instead of learning both? Or is there an advantage to learning both?
Right, so that's a good question. It depends on how much programming you want to do and for what reason. SQL is optimized for one thing, looking through databases, searching through databases, manipulating databases. Python is a language that you can do anything with. And so it's not specifically built for that one thing, right? So it's sort of the question of, like, oftentimes SQL might be the first programming language that someone learns because that's what they want to do, right? They want to move data and add data and, like, run analyses on data. Versus Python, you have to learn sort of like how all of programming works first, right? In order to tell it, okay, now do this subset of things. Imagine it's sort of just like Python is sort of like a robot you can tell to do whatever, but you have to set it up. You have to be like, okay, now we're going to learn what databases are. Once we learn that, now we're going to learn like what it means to like have a row in a database. And once you set all that up, which there's a lot of tools to help you do, right? It's not, I'm making it sound more difficult than it is. Once you have that set up, you can do the same thing. You can say like Python, go into the database, look for everything like this, add it up. You can tell it to do anything. You can't do that with SQL. SQL has like a set number. It's like less than 20 words that are used to like manipulate the different things inside of SQL. But it does it very efficiently and it's optimized for that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so Ruby can also go into a database, right? Like all of these languages can go into databases, but this is specifically for data manipulation. And the different versions of it is just like SQLite is like the chill light version that Mozilla Firefox often allows you to run a SQLite server just in the browser, and you can learn SQL that way. PostgreSQL is like heavy duty SQL that also processes geography and like latitude, and you can do like geographic queries, right? So like when we made Surgeon Scorecard, it's a PostgreSQL database because I want you to be able to put in your zip code. And then I want to pull in every doctor that is within like 50 miles of that zip code. And the database can handle that because it has all this extra stuff built in. MySQL is probably the most common, but SQL is sort of just the concept. It's like some like something query language. Okay, and then R. Has anyone ever heard of S? S is a, have you heard of SPSS? Yeah? Okay, so SPSS and maybe even Access, these are things that like old school CAR have used. And a lot of academics use SPSS because it is sort of like a really excellent piece of software that helps you do statistics. It also costs a lot of money. But a lot of universities can afford that because they have like whatever X number of licenses for their stats department, whatever. Journalists don't want to pay all that money. And so don't a lot of other people. And so people invented R, which comes before S. Oh, that's the only reason why. So they invented R. At the very beginning, it was very difficult to do anything on R because when you Google the letter R, like nothing happens. Now it is no longer the same because R has become very popular. When you Google R, it actually takes you to the right place. Now, R is a mix of what SQL does and what programming languages do. It is basically a statistical programming language. So it can't do everything that Python can do, but it can do way more than SQL can do. R can even sort of make charts out of your database if you want it to, because people are writing what's called R packages. Some of you have probably also heard of R Studio. It's both a company and a piece of software that helps you use R, that creates like basically a workspace for you so you can keep track of everything that you're doing. It gives you a lot of help when you're using it. And the people who are employed there full time just write R packages to make it better. It writes a lot like a normal programming language, which is why people who start in SQL and then want to switch have actually like kind of a hard time. But if you start in Python and you want to switch, it's way easier. Does that make sense? But a lot of people are actually doing both SQL and R now because they're trying to figure out like what works for my newsroom. And there are like pros and cons to both, really, right? It's like SQL has been around for longer. A lot of people have that already set up. It has a lot of enterprise level support versus R you can imagine as more of the like up and coming like underdog team that is like getting better. But they're very quite sophisticated now. And I mentioned this earlier, but it's written, I believe, I don't remember which of the C languages, either in Objective-C or C++ is what has been is what writes R. So sometimes R can be a little faster when it comes to certain things. But all of that is stuff I wouldn't need to worry about right now. Question?
When you're working on a project, do you already kind of know what you're maybe need to use, or like how do you manage?
That's a great question. When I'm working on a project, there's no doubt, well, sorry, if anyone's going to see anything from this project that's a website, there's no doubt that you're going to use these two things, right? It's just like, there's no other option. If I know there's going to be a database at ProPublica, I'm pretty much guaranteed to be using Ruby and Rails. If I just want to write a web scraper, it's possible that I know right off the bat I'm just going to use Python or I'm just going to use Ruby. And I say that because I learned how to scrape websites using Python, which is why I automatically use Python for that purpose. And then I program everything else in Ruby on Rails. So it's really quite flexible. Whether or not you know ahead of time, often what happens is you know roughly what you're going to do. And then as you do it, you're like, oh, now I need this thing. And then you just add it. Yeah. But I will say, once you get into programming, I got this like comment from someone once. I was like, why doesn't it bother you to have to use like so many programs at once? And then I was like, I don't know. Why does it bother you, right? Like, it was very confusing. And then I realized it's just because we're so used to switching between like so many different things in programming that it's sort of just normal. Yeah. But you can do a lot of things without using more than one thing on this board. So don't let that be a deterrent. Okay. So we've covered the database languages, right? This is a piece of software. This is also a piece of software. S is the language. QGIS we can talk about just on its own for a second. Who has heard of ArcGIS? Yeah, okay. So ArcGIS, this has a very similar relationship between R and SPSS, which is this is enterprise, money, establishment. And QGIS is a piece of open source software, which we'll talk about in a second. What that means, that is free. Anyone can download it. All of you can download it if you want. Both of these manipulate shape files and maps. So if you want to be a cartographer, this is the software that they use. When I was at the Washington Post, we had 3 cartographers in the graphics department, and they had their own maps of the entire world built in ArcGIS that we use for Washington Post maps. Which is why all the Post maps look a little different from everybody else. Same way the New York Times has the same thing. It's because we're using heavy-duty software to create maps, and people who have been trained to do that. Now, there are a lot of maps that you don't have to make from scratch, and you don't have to like label the roads because people like Google have done that for you, or OpenStreetMap, or Mapbox, or any of these like companies that make it easy for everybody to make maps. Those are all totally acceptable to use. And QGIS specifically is like, if you really have a lot of governments like to release just like a shape file. So if you want, like, I want all the county shapes, right? they won't give it to you already on top of a map. They'll give you the shapefile of all the counties that are connected to each other. And if you put that into a mapping software and add a layer that's like Google or whatever of the world, it goes in the right place because it has all that geographic information on it. But it is sort of literally just shapes that people build boundaries and counties and census tracts around. Okay. Yeah.
Also, when you're building a lot of these things, you don't really have to start from scratch anyway. If, like, for example, because you say you put a lot of your code like up, right? Like, because sometimes people will use like a base of an app or something that someone else built, and then you can kind of
So you don't have to start from the very beginning every time. There's certain things, right? Like with new data sets and things like that. Like I'm writing new SQL queries, but they're all roughly the same anyway. We build our own sort of like style sheets that people can use, and so we do significantly less work when we do that. But we do start not with like a blank page, but we start with a fresh template. And you guys will know a little bit more about what that means this afternoon as well, because there's some built-in templates into Sublime that you'll be using, just so that you don't have to write literally everything from scratch. But you can, if you want to, essentially. Sometimes if I'm making like a one-off project for something not related to work, I might start from scratch, because it doesn't have an established look and template already. But yeah. Other questions?
What's SPS, or like Access versus SPS?
Access is a Microsoft software that you can buy that just it helps you like analyze databases. It uses SQL secretly, or maybe not secretly. You can click on a tab and it says like show me the SQL. Yeah, but it doesn't. It tells you like you don't have to write in SQL if you don't want to. You can click and drag and point. SPSS is sort of like enterprise level statistics software. Okay, so we've got the mapping stuff down. I will go over the rest of these a little randomly. But API and RSS, I put them together because an API is most often built, let's see. It is, well, I guess I don't want to say what it's most often built in. It can be built using a lot of these different languages. But the point of an API is to give computers a version of a website to read. And that way it allows you as a developer to access information on that website in a way that is a lot easier and that's optimized for your computer, not for humans. So for example, Twitter has an API, right? A lot of people, you've probably heard of people say like, use the Twitter API or use the Instagram API. So what that does is instead of giving you this like nice user interface in which you see all the pictures and you can like stuff, like none of that. Instead, it's literally just like a text file that says like Instagram post number 1, URL to the picture, here's the comment that goes underneath. And so that way, like if you're building something that uses Instagram or uses Twitter on your project or in your like data viz that you want to do, you have a very computer readable version of that site. And you can also do queries on it that you would want to do as a programmer. So like one of the first projects that I did was an intern at the Wall Street Journal for a while, and there was a hurricane coming through New York, and we wanted an Instagram feed next to a map of like everybody who was tagging that hurricane to see what they were doing. And most often it was like people drinking beer in their basement, which was like kind of funny. But anyway, so like that's the kind of thing that you'd use. So I like give the Instagram API one query, and like this is the hashtag, I want all the posts, and then I just show them, right? And every time you go to my site, it asks, like your computer will ask Instagram for that information, and then my JavaScript will like load it all into your page for you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So APIs are very, like, they're like, you know, websites can choose to have them or not. You have to physically allow people to do this. You can't just like hit them. That's what web scraping is for when they don't have an API, but that's sort of what that's about. RSS is kind of similar. It's like old school a little bit, except it's for people. So RSS is sort of like when RSS readers were really popular. You can see an RSS reader version of the New York Times website where it's like national, and then here are all the articles. Software can read that too in an easier way to like put it all into one thing for you. Like if you use Pocket, if you use Instapaper, there we go. I was like, that other service I don't use. No, Instapaper, Pocket, whatever, all of those things can read RSS feeds. You can teach your own, like you can write a program that does it too. It's just if there's an API that is heavily preferred if you're using it as a programmer. Okay. So we understand front end, back end. Full stack basically just means you're a developer that can work in both stacks, right? All stacks, full stacks. Object-oriented programming is a philosophy of programming that all of the programming languages on this board follows, which is they're sort of like, I can explain this very briefly. There's sort of like two styles of programming, one of which is significantly more popular now, which is object-oriented. What that is when we tell a computer to do something, we do it around objects. So what that means is like I'm abstracting this a little too much for it to be completely accurate, but to demonstrate the point, it's sort of like I have a map. When there is a map, do these things to the map. It's like centered around like nouns and objects that are sort of on the page or in your project. There is another type of programming that's called, I believe, procedural programming, which is literally just do things in order. And so that's how you normally think about like giving instructions to a computer. But if you do things in the wrong order, you have to like go back and like write it in the right place. Versus if you do object-oriented, it will go top to down, right? It'll execute things in the right order, but allows you to say like every time there is a map, do this. You don't have to like write it in. It has sort of like migrated this way over the many years of programming since the computer was invented. And now the only times that I have encountered the other type of programming is like in a computer science 101 class where they teach you how to do it because it's part of like history and also part of how some systems are built back in the day, and it still is like transferred over to now. So I wouldn't worry about that. Right. So object-oriented allows you to do like nonlinear stuff, which will be very helpful when we do web scraping. So I wouldn't worry about it too much because you will probably never encounter the other type of programming ever.
I mean, like on the board, are there categories right now that you put in that?
In the other one?
Like, yeah, programs that you put in object-oriented.
Oh yeah, like everything. Like literally everything. Everything that is a programming language, I would put an object around into object-oriented programming. Okay, we're almost done. How am I doing at time? I'm like slightly over, but that's not bad. CMS, content management system, whatever you guys use to run your newspaper, your website, your school, whatever. It's all in a CMS because if we're doing it manually, like I don't know how that works or would be possible. Open source and debugging, right? So open source, who knows what open source means? It's pretty pervasive. Yeah, do you want to try defining it?
I mean, it's more of like, it's kind of like a philosophy of movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
It makes code available to anybody who wants to modify it.
Yeah, so open source is basically like your source is out in the open, right? You guys will be doing a lot of stuff with source today, but just know that when the word source is used in programming, it usually just means like the code that's behind the scenes, right? And so if it's open source, it just means all of your code is out in the open. Anyone can read it. People can collaborate on it. That's sort of like GitHub has made that really possible because everybody hosts their code in the same place. And so you can like make a version of it, make some changes, and then propose those changes back to the original project people. R is open source, right? There are entire programming languages that are open source because they want people to contribute. They want it to be a community-driven kind of thing. So that's sort of what open source means. And then debugging just means like anytime your code doesn't work, you just blame it on a bug, right? There's a bug. Like, I don't know what wrong, there's a bug. And when you're debugging, it means you're fixing the like problem that you introduced in your own code, usually what that means. When you're debugging other people's, though, it means you're fixing their problems. So you can think about it like that. And finally, Linux. Linux is a type of computer operating system. So everybody in this room has either a Macintosh or a Windows, right? Nobody has Linux. But one of our developers, Jeremy, who came in here to talk about Tabula, he has a Linux computer. Linux computers are very powerful in the sense that it is not, like Linux operating systems, I believe, are also open source. They don't come with like fancy user interfaces. They come with like a very basic desktop interface. Often people who use Linux prefer not to even see a desktop. They just type. And And potentially this Friday or early next Monday, you will all learn how to use your computers without clicking and dragging and just moving through a terminal. But Linux is sort of built for that, right? Like they don't want anything to do with like the man and like, it's great. So those are all the words on the board. Oh yeah, full stack just like is front end and back end programming. Like if I'm a front end programmer, I'm not a full stack programmer. But if I'm a front end and back end programmer, I'm a full stack programmer. It just means that like you're a generalist and that you can program front end and back end languages together in one person. A lot of teams are structured to be separate, so sometimes a company's not looking for that. They're looking for front end programmers or back end programmers or front end software developers. Back end software is the same thing. If they're looking for someone who's full stack, it means they don't want to split that up for some reason. And that is also something that we do here at ProPublica, which is all of our news apps developers are supposed to be full stack.
And can you talk a little bit about how the languages change and the versions change? Like, are people creating new? Oh yeah, there's like a lot of drama around that. So I'll talk about it just like a little bit. HTML and CSS really don't change very often. Like we're like in a revolutionary moment in which HTML5 and CSS3 is a thing, which is like kind of exciting because they're adding new features. But it doesn't mean all the old websites will break, right? Like they're doing that on purpose because we don't want half the internet to break. JavaScript has not had a new version for a very long time. I don't know if there ever will be. Same with PHP. But people are constantly writing these like little extra packages to go on top of it for you to write. So those come out all the time. So sometimes when you're writing JavaScript and you're like, I really want to do this thing, but I don't know how to program it myself, right? I really want to make a bar chart, or I really want to like make this ball bounce, right? You can Google like JavaScript library for bouncing. And sometimes people have written it for you, and they write very nice documentation so you can read it and copy this, then put this in your code, right? And you can just use it. Those are called JavaScript libraries. In the same way that, in the same way that Ruby has something called gems. It's the same deal. People writing little things that everyone can use in Ruby that you can install right away and just start using it. And so people add on to programming languages that way. There are like version battles sometimes. So in Python, for example, there's this huge, like Python 2 and Python 3 coexist right now. And I went to a Python conference in currently 2017. I went to a Python conference in like 2015 or 14 or something like that. And it was like thousands of people in this huge auditorium. And the keynote speaker was like, who's still on Python 2? And half the room raised their hand. And there's this like huge, I don't know why Python's very like resistant to moving to 3. People really love 2. But you can use either. And like people spend their time every day thinking about like, how do I make it easier for the people on 2 to move to 3? It's so great. Just people use what they want, really. And the nice thing about programming is they know they can't just change stuff because then everything breaks. And so when they version things, right, like if you stick, like I'm always going to use 2.7 of Python, you just make sure your project knows that, right? And then it'll stay that way. It won't automatically update. None of this like auto-update business that computers are used to doing. When it comes to programming languages, you have to deliberately update them. And when people make new ones, right, like they release them, they tell you that they're new, and they're usually, your computer will recognize they're different. Because they're different versions of the same thing.
Who's they in the context of a programming language?
Yeah, sure. So for example, Python and Ruby, well actually I'm not totally sure about Ruby, but Python is very community driven. So they is like a board that any of you can get elected to should you want to dedicate yourself to Python that much. On the other hand, there's like a they for HTML and CSS that is like a very like hard to get onto like web standards committee that decides like across the internet it should always be this way. Which is often includes people who like are founders of the internet who are on that they. So there are different theys for everything. They for R is really just like anybody. Anybody can do anything. You can propose changes to R. There's some people, like there are versions of R that you can get from different places. But yeah, everything has its own community, I would say. Yeah?
I was kind of wondering, like, for people who aren't like English proficient, or say you're in like a country like China, for example.
Yeah. What's up? What do? You have to program in English. Yeah. You can write things in Chinese, right? Like, but you have to program in English. There isn't like a non-English version of all of these that you could learn. Yeah. So in a way, it's very universal, but in a way, it's not. Yeah.
But it's funny. I only know this because we, for a project, used a Chinese API. It's like, it's all in English, except for the content. But like the structure, the words, it's all built in English. Yeah.
So there are no other programming languages out there?
No. There are no other language programming languages out there. Yeah.
They're all American. They're like started, like how?
Well, the internet started with the U.S. military, and that is all the history I know about that part. I can't tell you any stories past that. Say that again? DARPA? Yeah. That's all I got. Yeah, I mean, you can write your own programming language if you want. It's just like, will other people use them, and will other services support them, right? Like, will the internet read them? It's a big problem, right? If the internet won't read it, like, you're kind of screwed. And so it's really like programming, you know, it moves with the wind, right? It's about community. Some programming languages might just fall out of favor for some reason. It really just depends on the people.
For a program like R that's open source and it's like free to download, how does a program like that make money?
It doesn't. The point is not to make money, but RStudio makes money because they help people set up R. So you can build, oftentimes the model around open source, if you're trying to make money, is you make something open source and then you set up your entire business model around helping people install it and doing it for them. And so if someone has developers, like if you are a company that can afford and pays for developers who have this expertise, who can then take something open source and just use it, you can do that. Especially the bigger, the more enterprise level, right, the more complicated the stuff, the more expertise you need on staff to be able to handle it. And if you don't have that, you can pay a company to do it for you.
So they make money off the service, not the product.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yeah.
Are there, like, debates around having Western focus, like, programming language? Or
I don't know.
it seems like there'd be some tension there.
Yeah. I don't know. It's an interesting thing to look into. Yeah.
France. Similar, like England, they speak English. Australia. It's Portugal, Spain.
I will say, the thing is, you are not writing a bunch of English. You're writing like a bunch of random English words. So you're not like writing sentences in English when you program. You're writing like if, and then like something you name, whatever you want, and then like then, and then something else that you name. And then you write like a few more, like print or whatever. But it's like random. So it's not the worst in the sense that like, even for an English speaker, you have to learn what those words are and to put them in the right places.
Yeah, even if you know what it means in English, it can almost confuse you even more, right? Like print,
Right.
You're not literally printing something, it just
Right.
needs to have it show up somewhere else, right?
Yeah. And for a lot of the languages, like they make up the words, right? Like Ruby and Gems, like these are not, they're like thematic, but someone made them that way. And it doesn't really mean anything other than what it tells the words to mean. But it is all English-based, English language-based. So, yeah. Okay. If you have more questions about this, feel free to ask me at any time. But basically, what we are going to focus on in the Institute, HTML, CSS, jQuery, JavaScript, Python, and GitHub, and some other things that aren't on this board that Lena will teach you. Yeah. Okay, let me just see. I think I had one. Oh, yes. Okay, I have one last thing for you guys that I would like for you to do. So if you could get out your computers, I would like for you to do the following. So I want you to open Chrome specifically, not anything else, which is why we downloaded it at our install party. And then I want you to go to any website that you want. So you can go to ProPublica.institute, you can go to the website that your news organization hosts, you can go to New York Times, whatever you want. And then once you're there in Chrome, I want you to right-click anywhere you want on the page. And then there should be an option at the very bottom that says Inspect Element. If someone does not see that, please raise your hand. But I'm guessing you do.
Does it have to say element?
Inspect, that's fine too. Totally go for inspect. And then once you click on it, there should be like an extra little box that shows up with a bunch of text in it. Okay. I want you to go into that box and just like delete a bunch of stuff. Just like click on something and then click delete. And then click on something else and click delete. And see how that affects the website that you're on. Stuff should start disappearing until literally everything disappears. So what you're doing right now is looking at the source, right? And because browsers are pieces of software that help you read a website, it essentially just allows you to change it however you want as well. It doesn't change it for other people. Like you're not deleting it off of everyone else's computer. But the immediate version that shows up on your computer, you actually almost have complete control over. And we'll be using this tool a lot to do debugging later when you're writing your own HTML and CSS, because you want to see how it renders in a browser, right? How it previews, essentially. And then you can also do live edits in there if you want. And so later on when we get into HTML, you'll actually and you might be able to figure it out now, but I'm not going to go through this at the moment, is you could go in and change the text of how it looks. That's how fake tweets and screenshots get taken, all that jazz, which I will show all of you how to do later today. But you might be able to figure it out right now. Yeah. Oh.
So it'll allow that?
Yeah, you can put emojis in code. That's a thing. Yeah. Our website has emojis.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah, they're literally just emojis. Sometimes they show up differently on different people's computers. Like on Windows, they might be a different emoji, but they're still going to be like a shoe and a star.
Because on our CMS, we use Drupal, and it always would crash the site when you're trying to upload something, and you would always have to go into the back end to HTML and delete the emojis, and then, but it wouldn't actually delete. If you were embedding a tweet or something.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't
You
actually
have to get rid of the emojis in the tweet that you're embedding?
No, you would just have to get rid of it in the HTML, but then it wouldn't actually delete the emoji in the embed once you it's so weird, but if you didn't do that,
That's
it
crazy.
and then you couldn't do it anything.
Wow.
Yeah. A weird bug.
Yeah, I would say different CMSs try to strip things out because they don't want you to do certain things. Some CMS won't let you write JavaScript.
It's an older thing, right? And isn't that open source? So, yeah, we could have used something that was a little more modern, that WordPress or whatever, that you wouldn't have those issues, right?
Yeah, I've only worked with Drupal once, and I thought it was a total nightmare. But I also had never worked with it before, and that's how you generally feel about new things a lot. So, anyway. Okay, so I will show you guys how to do the page editing later if you haven't figured it out on your own, or feel free to try to break stuff on break. But you'll notice that when you refresh, everything goes back to normal, and everything is hunky-dory. It's because it's messing with not only the local version, but literally the version that you just previewed using the browser right now. And so when you refresh, it just gets a new version and then replaces that.
That file actually lives in
It lives inside of, say, Safari or Chrome, right? It doesn't live on your computer as a separate file, not unless you save it.
Can they see what we're doing?
No. It's all just on your computer. Yeah.